Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 11th of June 2024. Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. And I'm very, very pleased to say that Steve Keen is joining me tonight. We're going to have a really interesting conversation about economics and some of the broader issues that actually are really confronting us, I think, basically, because many economists don't actually understand what's going on. But before I bring Steve in, let me just remind you, as I always do, that we're not providing specific financial or legal advice. It's a general conversation only. We do moderate chat, but feel free to throw your questions and comments in. We've got a few questions already, and we'll try and get to those as soon as we can. Also, if you'd like to get my specific attention, if you use that Walk the World, that puts the questions in a different queue, which means it's more likely I'm going to be able to get to them. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means if you want to get your question top of the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Always greatly appreciated, and helps to cover some of the costs of what we do. With that out of the way, Steve, welcome. Great to see you.
Good to be in touch, Martin. We've managed to move continents, but not quite countries.
Exactly right. It is interesting, isn't it? That, I'm here now in the UK and you're in the Northern Hemisphere too. I gather you were back in Australia quite recently. What's it like down there?
Oh, look, it's always going to be one of the most pleasant places on the planet, particularly Sydney. And that's Sydney during autumn. You get beautiful weather. I still enjoy Australian culture, so I do miss that side of Australia. The politics is just the same old thing. We used to have the Liberals, and now we've got the Liberals light. And that's, the usual level of disappointment. I'd far rather have Albanese than have Morrison. I think I'd far rather have, I can't think of something horrible enough to be only slightly preferable to Morrison. But everybody's disappointed in the usual fashion. And decision-making is still, what makes a buck makes politics.
Yes, well, as we were saying just before the show started, Gallagher had a very good quote, right? The two sides of politics are two cheeks of the same bum. And in a way, that's the problem, because there's very little difference between them, right? Very little difference.
They've got their heads in their asses as well. Let's actually keep Galloway's line running there, because they basically, there's even a Labor Party ad that somebody sent to me today, the British Labor Party, saying there is no magic money tree. Well, Jesus, who said that before? We're getting quotes from Tory prime ministers as Labor Party slogans. So, there's not much hope they'll do anything of any significance until they're forced into it by circumstance.
Excellent. Well, Leonia put this question in a little while ago, which is, where are you based now? And also, what's your long distance perspectives? Well, you've given us some of the long distance perspectives, but where are you based now?
Amsterdam, just across the channel from you. If I get the train, it's a 4-hour journey that takes 3 hours in time zones. And if I fly, it's about 5 hours, courtesy of going through bloody security. But they still make the flights a damn sight cheaper than the bloody train. So I normally fly, which embarrasses me, but I'm stuck with it. So Amsterdam, and literally in terms of flight distance, it's 20 minutes away.
Yeah, it is crazy, isn't it? Of course, the rail system in the UK is, it's falling apart, really. They haven't invested. So,
well, they should privatise it so the private sector can make it work properly.
They've tried that, didn't we? Yeah. And in fact, they're now sort of undoing some of that. And, it's crazy. And then, of course, the investments have gone nowhere. But I'm always amazed, you whiz down through Europe on the fast trains, and then you go through the tunnel, and then you go back a generation or two and you're on the Victorian railways.
One of my fantasies is to bring back Maggie Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and place them one on a European train and the other on a UK train. Tell them the UK privatised and that the European did not, and then ask them which country they're in. I'm guaranteed they'd get it 100% wrong. They think the European trains are British private enterprise, and the European trains and the European trains are. They think the European trains are British private enterprise, and the British trains, I think, they're European socialism. It's completely turned out the other way around.
Absolutely. Well, you recently published a very, very insightful book called The New Economics, a Manifesto, and the thing about this book, which I think actually I regard as quite provocative, was so important And what I really would like to do, Steve, is to explore a few of the the stupidities that we've got in mainstream economics, right? Because we have people inside the Treasury, people in central banks, people academia, people in important positions all over the place, claiming they're economists, but also basically are living with a whole bunch of false assumptions about how economics works and how the economy works. And I would argue, don't know what you think, but I would argue that they are largely responsible for a lot of the mess that we've got at the moment, because the basic fundamentals are actually not the way they think they are.
You'll be intrigued. I've just actually listed this morning, signed my next book contract with the same publishers, Polity. And the title of that book, the working title, and pretty certain will be the final title as well, is How Economics Will Destroy Capitalism. And I'm being more provocative than I was even in the manifesto, because economists think they understand capitalism in the same way that Ptolemaic astronomers thought they understood the universe. And if they've got a paradigm which they know in intimate detail, which they can muscle enough to make it fit the data, and exactly this, well, actually not as well as the Ptolemaic astronomers fitted their Earth-centric model to the sun-centric system we actually live in, but it's basically the same contrast. And unlike astronomy, where generational change ultimately got rid of people who believed in Ptolemy's model, that doesn't happen in economics. So what you get is, I go through as a radical critic of the economics from literally my first year as an undergraduate back in 1971, and there's a whole bunch of people who joined me in that critique of neoclassical economics back at Sydney University in 73. And we go and we're fighting against the professors who are maintaining the old paradigm. You fast forward 50 years, and the successors of the professors are still pushing the same paradigm, even though it's been found there are so many anomalies between the theory's predictions and what actually happens in the real world, that if it was a decent science, it would have been rejected 100 years ago, not just 50. So we've got a false paradigm which is convincing. Anybody who falls for it and then thinks they've got the secret to life, the universe, and everything. But what they've actually got is a completely false model that they can only maintain by not knowing of or ignoring the logical and empirical conundrums that it's generated for itself in the last 1.5 centuries, which is when it began back in the 1870s.
Yeah, and I am quite a fan of Thomas Kuhn and the Scientific Revolution, which he said in that book, why is it that suddenly there are paradigm switches, but before that, everybody says, no, this can't possibly be right. And it's the weight of power and it's the weight of authority. So everybody sort of goes down one route. And then all of a sudden, there's a tipping point. But that tipping point doesn't come easy. And I actually think it's exactly the same as you're talking here. The fundamental paradigms that are driving a lot of the economic thinking, and therefore the political thinking, because, of course, a lot of the economists are sitting in the Treasury and driving policy through that way, basically means that they're pushing a rock uphill because they're actually not understanding the way that gravity works.
That's right. It's appallingly dangerous. And this is why I say, quite literally, I expect economic theory will destroy capitalism, because their model of how capitalism actually works versus how it actually works is so contradictory that their policy advice actually makes the system worse. And the absolute worst example of that, of course, is what they've done on climate change, which, even given my low expectations of neoclassical economics, I have to congratulate William Nordhaus and about the 2,500 economists he's now got working with him, and they call climate change economists. They were even worse than I thought they could possibly be. And for that reason, we have trivialized the dangers of climate change. They're going to start hitting us quite likely in terms of a drastic impact starting this year. And certainly most people I know working in climate science think if we continue on the current trajectory, and that's an if in terms of policy terms, but if we do, there's no chance of civilization seeing out the century. And there's possibly no chance of it seeing out the next 30 years. So that's how drastic climate scientists feel about the situation we're in. Economists reckon it's going to reduce the rate of economic growth by 0.1 or 0.3% per annum. and they are completely and absolutely wrong on the basis of ludicrously false assumptions, which any climate scientist could tell them they were false, but they simply published the stuff. They didn't get it refereed by climate scientists, and that's the brick wall to which neoclassical economics is now driving us at high speed.
Well, I'm interested because I have the same view that it isn't just, the problem with capitalism. It's the problem with saving the planet. And actually, economists are responsible in no small mean amount for some of the stupidity and some of the destruction that we are seeing and we're going to see. And yet it's like they're looking the other way and everything's absolutely fine. Let's go through just two or three of those bigger false assumptions. And, we can start wherever you want. But the one, of course, I keep coming back to because I'm interested in the way that money works and the way that banks work. I mean, the whole fractional reserve stupidity is one of the most critical assumptions that they still run with, and yet is clearly nothing like reality.
Yeah, I mean, this is the crazy thing. People who don't do a degree in economics or don't study it anyway think economists are experts on money because, hey, the economics is about money. But in fact, if you go right back to the early 1800s, and there's a debate that goes even earlier than that, but 200 years ago, there was a character called Jean-Baptiste Say, who people might know from the term Say's law, and he argued that money is irrelevant. People don't use money. They don't try to accumulate it. They don't try to hide how much they have. All outrageously ridiculous assumptions. But that was embedded into the foundation of neoclassical economics. So they modeled the economy as if it's a barter system. And they leave out banks and debt and money from their macroeconomic models. And their models of money creation, which they have to have, are there just to justify not using money at all in their macroeconomic theory. And yet people who think economists should be experts of money are right, they should be. And they don't understand the monetary system, and therefore what they allow to happen on the private money creation side and what they prevent happening on the government money creation side is a large part of the cause of the dilemmas we're now in.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the old Bank of England paper that came out a few years ago that said, actually, it's not the way you think it is. It's the other way around, right? Because actually you lend more. Lending creates effectively more money which goes into the system. It's not deposit led, it's actually lending led. And that means you can lend as much as you want, basically.
With limits which are because the neoclassicals, as soon as they said, oh, but there are limits you're not taking account of, and those limits mean the government still controls the amount of money in the economy. So for those who haven't done an economics degree, the lesson that you'll get taught in an economics textbook about how money is created, first of all, thinks that governments create cash, which is true. Okay, but they then think that what happens is people get the cash and they go to the bank and they deposit the money in the bank, and the bank hangs on to 10% of the money they deposited and lends out the other 90%. And then that 90% gets deposited at another bank, which hangs on to 10% of that, which is 9%, lends out 81%, and on you go. So over time, $100 in deposit that way will create $1,000, what they call the money multiplier. Now, that is precisely the theory that the Bank of England said in 2014 is simply wrong. And I've been part of a school of non-orthodox economists which have been arguing this for going on a century, over a century, in fact, that this is simply a false model of how money is created. But yet that's what they get taught. And then what it means is they say, too much money, government's fault. Too little money, government's fault. Nothing to do with the market. Now, in fact, when you look at how banks create money, as John Kenneth Galbraith once said, it should be more difficult. It's offensive that it's as simple as it turns out to being. But banks create money by entering. If you've got to have a member of the public, the private sector who agrees to this, of course, but agree to taking on a loan, say a loan of $1 million to buy, I don't know, a house in Broken Hill, and they put $1 million in your bank account, and they put $1 million against you as the debt you now owe to them. So the change in debt creates money. That's all there is to it. And with double entry bookkeeping, and I've invented a software package that makes it incredibly easy to see this that I call Minsky. That's all that's involved. There's no role for reserves in the direct creation of money. There's no way that the reserves limit the amount of money that can be created. So the private sector creates large amounts of money by creating loans, and those loans should be going to productive uses, but in fact they normally fund Ponzi schemes like for Australian housing market. So we have the government, and rather than saying this is a bad thing and we shouldn't let runaway credit drive house prices so that young people can no longer afford to buy them, rather than saying that, oh no, it's all equilibrium and nobody's problem, and it's all the supply side of things. They don't look where the demand comes from, and that's what's causing the problems. Too much private debt.
Right. So there are two observations. The first is that the private banks basically, start the flywheel, right? They then drive house prices higher, which means they can lend more, which means that they can actually lend more, which means that they can drive house prices higher. So that's the Ponzi scheme, right? But the critical point that you've made there, it stops investment in things that should be being invested in, right? And that's the fundamental problem. If you look at the amount of debt and lending from the banking system in Australia to small businesses 20, 30 years ago and now, it was 2/3, 1/3 probably. Now it's 1/3, 2/3. So what's happening is that more and more of this stuff that's being created is just going around the system to pump prices higher and higher to be able to make it more difficult for people to buy. Makes the balance sheets of the banks look great because they just inflate them, but it's non-productive.
Absolutely. And that's the dilemma we have. It's a global thing. Of course, Australia is just one of the most egregious examples. But globally, the banking system, by being deregulated, and this is where Milton Friedman and Maggie Thatcher and they said Charles Ponsonby is an honest person versus the people today, incredibly correct. And you should actually look at a wonderful book called Ponzi's Scheme by Zuckoff, I think Zuckoff, and he explains Ponzi's personal history. He's actually is typical, like he's obviously narcissistic, because that's almost vital for the sort of things he did. But he cared about other people. And he actually, I'm not joking, literally gave the skin off his own back to save the life of a nurse. I can't see Donald Trump giving the skin off anything. Well, I don't want to go there, but there's an obvious joke, but I'll leave hanging. Which is another obvious joke. That's the only bit of skin. I heard a great joke, actually. You might appreciate this. Just saw somebody jokes about Donald Trump. And once Donald Trump hops into a lift, and shortly before it shuts, a gorgeous woman walks inside and says to him, and shuts the door and says, Donald, I'm so impressed with you. I so admire what you do. I want to give you a blowjob right now. And Donald says, okay, but what's in it for me?
Steve, yes. Cookie Boy says you should be the next RBA governor, right? Now, it's interesting. The RBA governor was actually in Parliament last week and talking about trying to defend the indefensible in many ways. Yeah. But one of the things that she said was that GDP per capita is not really relevant by way of a measure. Whereas, of course, everybody knows that GDP is a stupid way of trying to measure anything. And it's another of those fallacies, isn't it? That, what does GDP actually tell us? It tells us about activity. The more activity, especially if you have more people coming in the country with higher migration, that'll lift GDP. But the share of the pie for individuals continues to go backwards, so down 0.4. What's your take on this whole GDP per capita and GDP fallacy, and why do central banks not seem to get it?
Well, I mean, the GDP versus GDP per capita, that's a clear fallacy. What the GDP is saying is the country getting poorer, but that's okay. GDP is growing because there are more people in the country. That's ridiculous. GDP per capita is what people feel, as Down Under Drover has just said. So yes, you want to be raising living standards. You're not increasing living standards by reducing living standards, but that's what she's fundamentally arguing. And it shows the extent to which they get themselves caught up in knots. But the interesting thing, which as you know, I discuss in that book, is that when you look at the global level, the rate of change of GDP, they call it, that's called gross world product as opposed to GDP for domestic. The rate of change of gross world product is almost identical to the rate of change of energy usage. So what GDP is actually a good measure at the extent to which we're exploiting energy that we find on the planet, which it technically speaking, it's called free energy because nobody had to make it in the first place. It simply exists. We find it in fossil fuel deposits, or we find it in sun rays, and we then exploit that free energy to create products, which is the basis of capitalism. So when you look at the global level, GDP is a very good measure of how much energy we're using. But I saw somebody arguing on Twitter a couple of days ago, and it's quite true. A beautiful tree contributes nothing to GDP until you destroy it, and then it contributes to GDP. So what we're leaving out of GDP is the damage we're doing to the biosphere in which we live. And that was okay. You could do that 200 years ago. You could even do it 100 years ago. You could do it to some extent 50 years ago. You can't do it today because the increase in the load that humans are putting on the biosphere has gone beyond a critical level. And so if you're not acknowledging what our economic activity does to damage the sustainability of the biosphere, you're not being what economists should be, which is aware of the entire circumstances of rather than treating the environment as an externality. If it's an externality, if that externality ceases to exist, then so do we. And that's the route we're unfortunately on, courtesy of economists.
And it's interesting that some governments now are talking about other measures of well-being as better proxies of what's going on. Except, of course, if you actually look at well-being in terms of, the pressure of debt, or if you look at the ability to move around the country, or even I guess if you look at some of the more recent consumer sentiment data, all of these other things seem to me to be almost trying to deflect from that fundamental truth that you've been talking about, that actually the lens through which we've been measuring success for several decades is actually taking us completely in the wrong direction.
Yeah, I mean, this is. I'm no great fan of alternative measures of GDP, et cetera, because they're leaving out the most important thing, and that's the rest of the planet. And I also don't think you can get a measure which would enable you to have a successful capitalist or any type of economic system on the planet where you made a profit out of if you included your environmental costs, because virtually by definition, the energy you waste in exploiting free energy that you then dump back into the biosphere will mean your total net output is negative. So there's a real dilemma from a physics point of view, in that if you tried to fully account for all the cost involved in production, you'd always get a loss. So it's something which I think it's a dilemma that applies whatever social system you're talking about, and to have I like the way that one of my great friends in this area, an atmospheric physicist, Tim Garrett, Tim puts it beautifully, and he says that what we have, first of all, we as humans, we are able to exploit deposits of free energy we find in the environment that other animals can't exploit. We use that extra energy to lift our levels above the average of all the other animals in the biosphere, and that's what enables us to maintain civilization. But then we have to dump the waste for that back into the actual environment itself, and that waste slowly reduces the gap between the high energy we're using from deposits, and the background level of the environment, because to actually exploit that free energy, there must be a gap between the energy content, potential energy of the fuel, and the energy level of the environment into which you dump the waste. As that reaches equivalent, that you can't use energy at all in any productive sense. And we're also exploiting. We're pushing up the bottom into which we'd have to dump waste heat to be able to use energy effectively, and we're mining and reducing the stock. So we're squeezing ourselves in a sandwich between the two. And unfortunately, economists have told us to completely ignore that. And that's why we're starting to see the biosphere breaking down in terms of the biosphere that's necessary to sustain our civilization.
Right. And the point there again is that the signals are there for those who want to see them. But if you actually have been educated in a particular way of thinking about economics, et cetera, then those things are not seen as important. So it's a set of blinkers.
Yeah, it's like they're looking at like your computer system with their eyes with black lenses. They can't see a damn thing, or they just see the particular framework they're on. So economists, for example, and this is something that I've made a positive contribution to, and it's why I didn't actually get involved in critiquing them on environmental issues until very recently, 5 years ago, is they presume you can have output by combining workers and machinery and technology in a factory. No, you can't. Okay, labor and technology and capital in a factory won't produce a brass razoo unless you pump energy in. Okay, and they don't have that in their models. Now, what it means is they completely ignore the impact of of the impact that availability of energy has. So when they try to include energy using their framework, they argue that, well, energy is worth about 4 or 5% of GDP. So the change in output for a change in energy, if you had a doubling in energy, you'd get a 5% increase in GDP. Now you look at the data, if you had a doubling of energy, you'd get a doubling of GDP. So that's how empirically wrong their perspective is. But what it means is they don't really look at the impact of dumping waste into the environment. They don't look at the impact of reducing the physical supplies of commodities. So they have an aetherial vision of how capitalism functions. When we want that as a bioevolutionary or biophysical framework, if we don't exploit what we find for free in the environment, we don't have any output at all. So I've got to be including that in the argument. And my little line that led me to work out the mathematical logic of this was a very simple aphorism. It is that labor without energy is a corpse, and capital without energy is a sculpture. So you must have energy inputs to produce output, but they don't even look at that. So I've saw one of my favorites was a German economist that I really dislike called Rudy Bachmann. He really dislikes me, so it's a mutual misadmiration society. But he wrote in a paper on what was going to happen to Germany with the energy crunch coming from not having access to Russian energy, which of course they found all sorts of ways around it. But he said that literally said a 10% a decrease in energy would cause a 0.4% fall in GDP. And he said, if you take the assumption that people that I come from, the post-Keynesian school, they argue that a 10% fall in energy would fall to 10% fall in GDP. And that's obviously wrong because that involves crazy results in terms of the marginal product of labor and capital, blah, blah, blah. In other words, it's saying this contradicts neoclassical assumptions. Therefore, it must be wrong. You look at the data, it's dead right. So therefore, the assumptions themselves are wrong. And again, it's just like, imagine you had a Ptolemaic astronomer advising Elon Musk on how to get to Mars. Okay. That's how useful economists are.
I always think of the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Do you remember at one stage they actually went to a planet and they were things like hairdressers and,
the Golgafrinchians.
Yeah, exactly. But there weren't any economists on that planet. They should have.
I know. In fact, I did find. I mean, we're both great fans of sci-fi and comedy, as you can tell. And there's a section where they're going to the planet of Magrathea, which of course is the planet that makes planets. And Ford Prefect was having a go at Zaphod for even wanting to do it. And he said, "Come on, Zaphod, that's nonsense. Magrathea is the sort of thing that parents tell their kids that they want them to grow up to be economists." So he does actually kick the bastards in the balls. So here's to Douglas Adams.
Absolutely, yes, folks. If you've not read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, it's a laugh, but it's also quite telling in so many ways too.
It's wonderful. Yeah, definitely one of the great works of literature.
Absolutely. Now, Steve, I want to come back to debt just briefly. Just before I get into public debt, there was this question that came in a little while ago, which it's worth just thinking about briefly. The question for Steve: when a loan goes into default, is then money destroyed?
Yeah, it's a complicated chain in that particular case. But if you one thing I've invented is a software package called Minsky, which is designed to answer double entry bookkeeping question, which is what this amounts to. So if you have somebody who's been given a loan and then they're not able to service that loan, first of all, they're transferred to a underperforming loan, then a bad performing loan. So the bank have a range of different classes of assets, and they'll shift it from performing loans, non-performing loans, and then in default. Now, when they may say you're in default, they have to acknowledge that the asset that they have for themselves with the value of the loan, let's say it's $1 million, and you can't repay it, they've got to write that $1 million off. That means a negative on the asset side. The only way you can balance that in accounting terms, they have a negative on the bank equity side. And therefore that destroys money by destroying the equity of the banking sector. So when I put my overall framework together, people normally say like money is the sum of deposits plus cash. Deposits of bank accounts plus cash. I say it's money is the sum of bank deposits plus the value of bank short-term equity plus cash. And therefore, when that particular hits the money supply by reducing the equity of the banking sector, and what they'll often do as a result of that, they've got to raise more short long-term equity. So what they'll do is either issue bonds, which go down as long-term, and therefore enable them to boost the asset side and boost the equity by selling those bonds. Or I've just forgotten the second element, but they'll either issue bonds or issue shares in that sense to get their equity back up again. But when a loan goes bad, and it has to be acknowledged as going bad, then the banks take a hit on the equity side.
Absolutely. And of course, at the moment, if you look at the situation in Australia, the absolute default rates on mortgages is rising, but it's rising from quite a low level. But the banks have been extending and pretending for the last 18 months or 2 years, moving people onto interest only and all sorts of things like that. I think the tide's going out now because the interest rates are going to be higher for longer, despite Canada and a few other countries dropping rates a little. Australia can't do that. And my own suspicion is that it's going to be quite a significant negative impact on the banks. But of course, financial stability rules all, doesn't it? And that's one of the other factors that's in all of this. Every time you listen to these central bankers talking, they're talking about, well, financial stability is all. So, how can financial stability be the ultimate pinnacle of outcome?
Well, this is the crazy thing. Economists who think banks don't matter in macroeconomics are in charge of the macroeconomy, and that means they're making decisions about money while thinking money doesn't matter at the same time, which is crazy. But that's why we've got a false paradigm dominating the economics discipline. So they believe that they can control the rate of inflation by controlling the rate of interest. Then they're not. I've been distracted by people. Jerry there with the Magrathea.
Yes.
Yeah, that's perfect. They believe they can control the rate of inflation by controlling the rate of interest, but they don't even look at what's happening in terms of what that does to the asset backing of banks, because the banks have got large amounts of bonds on their portfolios. If you have long dated bonds, then putting up interest rates reduces the value of the bonds, and that's actually challenging the financial viability of banks in the very first instance. But there's also I've been distracted by music outside in the heart of Amsterdam, and you get music suddenly starts coming in, and you don't know where it's coming from. The the damage that they do to financial sustainability can be seen by the 2008 financial crisis, which they did not see coming. The mainstream, if you look at the advice from mainstream economists, they thought 2008 was going to be a fabulous year. And they were telling politicians to go out there and take the credit for the great economic performance in 2008. Now, this is one of the reasons the Bank of England produced that paper, because what happened, you had a bunch of Tory politicians standing up saying how great 2008 is going to be, and then RBS falls over and you have the BNP crisis and it's all a total disaster. They gave the Bank of England staff one hell of a dressing down. And that's what actually enabled the group that I know inside the bank, who are non-mainstream economists, to publish that paper in 2014. Now, if you think economics is an empirical discipline, you'd think, well, after being chastened by getting 2008 wrong, they'd listen to people who got it right, which includes me, but also they'd listen to people who say banking doesn't operate the way your theory says. Look at the Bank of England paper. That's not what economics did at all. They have ignored that 2008 and 14 paper by the Bank of England. And my two favourite instances, though they've got many, but my favourite one actually is giving the Nobel Prize, which is not a Nobel Prize, by the way, to Ben Bernanke in 2022 for his work on money. Now, in what they call the scientific document for the Nobel Prize in 2022 to Ben Bernanke, they do not even cite that 2014 Bank of England paper. They don't cite the 2017 one from the Bundesbank. They ignore other central banks. I think the Bank of New Zealand or the Bank of Norway also came out with similar statements that banks create money by loans. Now, they want to stick with a model where banks are what they call intermediaries, who pass money on from savers to borrowers. And what that means is, and this is why they leave it out of their macroeconomics, if that were the real world, then when somebody extends a loan, their spending power would go down, but the person they gave the loan to, their spending power goes up. Equally, when the reverse happens and somebody who's in debt repays the person they borrowed from. The person who's repaid the debt, their spending power falls, but the person who lent the money and has now had it repaid, their spending power rises. So one cancels the other out, and you can therefore ignore the banking sector at the aggregate level. But in the real world, the one they should be attempting to model, banks create money by creating debt. And they then, so that causes a boost in demand. When banks extend more loans, that creates more monetary demand, and that also creates real demand, as economists prefer to call it. They try to argue that everything the money system does just affects the price level, doesn't affect real economic activity. That's garbage. It does as well, but they leave all this dynamic out, and then they get surprised all the time when the economy doesn't behave the way they want it to. And we're talking about a negative surprise with the 2008 financial crisis. But there's a positive surprise going on in America right now, where because they've put the rates up so much on government debt, that's what the interest rate rises, but the central banks actually do. They increase the interest rate for government bonds. Because they've put the rates up so much, they're about 5% or 6% now on government bonds. And because government debt is running at 100% of GDP, and new bonds are coming out to back the interest, those new bonds are 5% of GDP. Now, what you're doing is giving a boost to the demand levels of people who hold government bonds. It's not the poor who hold them. It's the middle class to the wealthy who hold them, but that's boosting aggregate demand in America. So they thought putting up interest rates would reduce economic growth and demand and economy, expecting a slowdown in the economy, and they're flummoxed that it's still performing well. It's performing well because what they think is controlling the rate of inflation is actually boosting aggregate demand.
Right, and the very important point there is that all of the issuing of those bonds, and in fact the broader government support programs through COVID and through the energy crisis, that created the inflationary pressure in the first place, right? So they created the mess. So standing there and saying nothing to do with us, it's the war in Ukraine or it's the COVID thing, right? They created the inflation problem that they're now trying to solve, but they're issuing, particularly in the US, but elsewhere as well, they're issuing more government debt to try and actually continue the momentum, which again is another of these complete fallacies.
Yeah, this is why you've got to think about banking in double entry bookkeeping terms, and that's why I invented the Minsky software to enable that to be done. I must say I didn't actually understand it fully myself when I first invented Minsky, because I didn't realize the importance of double entry bookkeeping. But that's absolutely the foundation of how money is created. The banks are basically double entry bookkeeping machines, and the reason they can create money is that by the fact that they can create both loans and deposits, they can increase the asset and the liability side of their individual ledgers. And they're the only institutions in society that can do that. So that's why banks take deposits, not because they need the money to lend out, but because they couldn't actually mark up deposits as well as marking up loans, and they couldn't create money. So that's essential to understand how banks operate. And neoclassicals don't want to know. And this is what, I just realized this recently. I had a conversation with he ended up being a rather nice bloke, George Selgin, who's an economist with the Cato Institute, that is a quite rabid free market lobby group in America. And he wrote an argument defending the argument that banks are simply intermediaries who enable savers to lend to borrowers and vice versa to repay, and actually don't create debt. He went through and very carefully, and I applauded him for this, omitted all the possible ruses to make that look like banks are operating as intermediaries, and said banks do create money. They put a sum into your loan account. Let's say they call it credit dollars per year, and they put credit dollars per year into deposit accounts, and that creates money. But he then tried to argue they were constrained by interbank lending. And I wrote a reply to him, and as part of it, I think he realizes this now, because we had a conversation on my live show on a Saturday last week. But in that, I went through and said this is what he does in the paper, and I says he ignores term deposits. And then he said, Keen, this is on Twitter before he actually met him face to face. Oh, Keen said that I think banks just borrow from each other, as if I don't think they have long-term deposits. But you look down further and said, this is a decent simplifying assumption, which I will also make to leave out a confusing issue. So he just got angry at it. And what he did, he didn't read my high paper. He skimmed it looking for something he'd disagree with. He found it, and then he didn't read any further. And that is how neoclassicals have treated the Bank of England paper as well. They read it, say, oh, this can't be right. And then they scoff off, or they just ignore it. So you're trying to point out a huge anomaly. And to me, this is a bit like, and I think I know how Galileo felt. I'm not saying I'm Galileo's successor, but I know how he felt, because he invented the telescope. People may not know this in detail, but Galileo was arguing for a sun-centric vision of how the solar system operated against the dominant Ptolemaic vision that the Earth was the center of not just the solar system, but in fact the universe, and the whole universe revolved around the Earth on concentric circles, spheres, because they call it, and the heavenly spheres, and the explanation for the planets occasionally going east and occasionally going west across the sky, whether they're also on other spheres that rotate on these spheres, blah, blah, blah. But an essential part of their ideology, and it is an ideology, was that the heavens are perfect. Heavens remain perfect forever. Earth is where things rise and decay. And when he built the telescope, first thing he did was look at the moon, and he saw craters. Now, of course, before Galileo, observation of the universe was by your eyes. So suddenly you could multiply by a factor of 10. It's now obvious that what they called the seas were in fact plains, and there were these, the man and the moon stuff, they were craters. So obviously there'd been collisions between heavenly bodies. He then looked at Jupiter, and I think he saw 4 moons of Jupiter. We know there's about 30 or more now, but 4 moons he saw. And he tried to get his Ptolemaic astronomers to look down the telescope, and they wouldn't. They refused. And he wrote a letter to Kepler, of course, on his size. They had a sort of conflictual relationship. It was an ego clash in many ways, but they finally became close friends. And he wrote to him at one stage and said, what are we to say, my dear Kepler, about these learned men of the local university who were the perspicacity, I can't pronounce it properly, but with the attitude of a snake that's already eaten a meal. They refused to look down the telescope. And they refused to look at something which would empirically contradict their paradigm. And that is exactly the same state that neoclassical economics is in now, especially about money, but virtually everything else. They simply do not want to look at stuff which contradicts their belief system. And that's why I call them, they're far more a religion than they are a science.
I was just going to say exactly that, Steve, that it is actually a religious set of beliefs, right? Mm. Religion in the sort of the sense that it determines how you see the worldview. And so the worldview that they have is determined by the training that they've had and the assumptions that they've made and the fact that they've talked to other people who all think the same. So I think central bankers through the Bank for International Settlements all talk to each other. So they're all drinking the same Kool-Aid, but anything that is beyond their ken, they just simply ignore. And despite the fact that the indicators are not actually matching with what they thought. So they've been really, really good, haven't they, at projecting forward employment or wages growth or anything. I mean, all the charts show they're all over the place. And yet that doesn't get them to say, well, actually, maybe our models are wrong. And part of the frustration that I have is they actually have models which they use to determine what they're going to do, right? And yet the models are wrong, but they don't actually recognize their models are wrong. It's a fundamental fallacy. And I always think of the simulation games of trying to land, something on the moon, right? Which is it's quite difficult to actually get all of the bits right. It's easy to crash. Now, some of the models that some of the central banks are using are just not effective because they miss so many of the elements.
It's actually a very complex story, and I'm glad you opened with talking about Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, because you look at how humans behave, and the fundamental point that Kuhn made in opposition to the argument of Popper, Karl Popper, who was the Pardon me, they had a philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who argued that what scientists do is they put forward what he called bold conjectures, and they then try to refute those bold conjectures. And the process of conjecture and refutation is what leads to progress in science over time. So that was the accepted ideology, accepted theory of how science works. And then Kuhn tried to apply that by looking at astronomy. But when he did that, he found that even though he was critical of, the crazy assumptions of the Ptolemaic astronomers, the work they did to make those assumptions fit the data was incredible. You had to work out, what deferent you had, what epicycle you added to the deferent, what your offsets were, an incredibly complicated mathematical procedure. And once you got it right, A, you were bloody convinced your model was the ant's pants. B, you had 300 other people that done 1,000 other people that done similar things, had slightly different models. You'd fight with each other all the time over what to refine it. No one would say, what if the Earth is not the center of the universe? What if the sun is? What does that do? And they'd reject it out of hand. Now, this is how humans behave. Scientists behave the same way. The difference which came from Galileo forward is why we talk about the Reformation, is that Galileo, as a rival, came and said, let's test your assumptions. Okay, you assume that the heavens are perfect. You assume everything orbits around the Earth. Let's take a look at those. Oh, what are those bumps on the moon? Where do they come from? What are those moons doing orbiting Jupiter rather than orbiting the Earth? How can you put that inside your paradigm? Now, the thing is, he could never convince the Ptolemaic astronomers to change their mind. That's the lament he wrote to Kepler. And more recently, Max Planck, who's the person who gave us quantum mechanics. Max Planck tried to solve what's called the the black body radiation problem. And he found that the only way he could make the data model fit the observations was if you presumed energy came in small packets he called quanta. Otherwise, you could not get a successful fit to the actual empirical data. And he tried to convince, he was stunned by the result. Everybody thought energy was continuous back in those days. But he accepted the mathematical result, and he tried to persuade his fellow Maxwellian physicists that that was the case. And he said, I did not convince a single one. And that's why he wrote the line, effectively, history advances one funeral at a time. Now, the reason that works in physics but doesn't work in economics is not that economists live forever, okay, but that the ideas the economists have are so appealing to young students, so impressionable, it provides a perfect system. Yeah, everybody gets their marginal product, so you get paid what you're worth. Okay, the system reaches equilibrium. Of course, is a good thing to be in equilibrium. Blah blah blah. It's so seductive that you can find enough people who believe it to replace the current professors who also believe it. So 50 years ago, I was fighting against Professors Hogan and Simkin at Sydney University. I became friends with Hogan ultimately, as it happens, not Simkin. But they believe this stuff, and I led a group of about 300 students who were saying it's all shit. We want to change what we're being taught. This is nonsense. But there are enough people who believe that nonsense to go on and replace the professors. And so you don't get generational change in economics, where you do get generational change in physics. And I'm getting long-winded here, but I'll finish with one more point. You made the comment about effectively scientists testing their models against empirical reality. That happens in a genuine science. So if you look at meteorology, for example, there's thousands of meteorological models. They have their own testing system to look at an array of models and then say which ones are fitting the data better. And they have model ensemble techniques that they use to make overall forecasts, because they regard one model will be more biased in one way, a multitude of models will be closer, and they're testing them all the time. Economists don't do that. Okay, they produce a model which fits a particular set of biases. They'll look at the 1DS, what they call dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. They'll compare one to the other and so on. They will not compare those DSGE models to any alternative paradigm. And so what you get is lock into that particular paradigmatic way of thinking. And the empirical failures are huge. So the leading DSGE model came out in 2007. And it was celebrated. We've got the ultimate model. We're going to predict everything. Did it predict the financial crisis? Of course not.
Exactly. And in fact, Rebecca asked a little while ago, why do we think the reason why they keep using their models, even though they never work? And it comes back almost to blind religion, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Because I mean, I fell for this stuff. And you, Martin, did you do economics at school?
I did economics at school and philosophy at university.
Okay. Well, you supply and demand. Okay, you fall for it.
Yeah.
So well, generally you get paid your marginal product. That seems like a fair thing. You get paid what you contribute to output. All this stuff, and it describes a perfectly functioning system. And so it's very hard for somebody to, having got that embedded in their heads, and then develop mathematical techniques that give that belief system uh, a physical form. It's incredibly hard to say, "Oh, Jesus, this is wrong. I got it all wrong." And what happens is that a minority do that. They become people like me who become critics of the mainstream. But enough of them continue doing this in their own community, and they continue reinforcing it. And so I think the only analogy to explain why economics behave that way is the religious one. You're never going to get anybody in the Vatican agreeing that Muslims have found the body of Jesus Christ. And therefore they want to know. Like, you found a corpse from 2,000 years ago that's got the halo bit and all the stuff and the holes down the side, and his mum was Mary. You're not going to even look. And so that's what the classic example, again, coming back to that Bank of England paper. You would think that economists would take that seriously. They can ignore people like me because I'm a radical, outside the mainstream. Ignore the Bank of England when the Bank of England had to approve that paper being published, not even cited in the prize for Bernanke when you're giving a prize for his theories of money. This is what they do. They do not look down the telescope.
Absolutely. I remember I chatted with Michael Hudson a couple of years ago.
Oh, yeah.
And we were talking there about just this point that, in fact, the basis of academia is part of the problem, right?
It is.
Because it's a self-perpetuation of a particular way of thinking about economics. And actually, anybody who doesn't actually swim with the tide, as it were, gets swept away simply because that thought world is so strong and so powerful and so influential that it actually stops people exploring beyond it.
It does. Like, that's why people like me end up at university like Kingston, for example, which is a pretty low rating English university, whereas the people who believe this stuff end up at Cambridge and Oxford. And so if you want to find realistic economics, you've got to go to the minority universities. Whereas with physics in general, because physics over 500 years has built up that experimental test of theoretical propositions. I'm not saying there aren't problems with physics at various times, like string theory looks like it's got itself well and truly into a logical hole. Okay,
I think generally well and truly knotted.
I know it's a very knotted discipline, but economics is far, far worse than the worst you could possibly imagine for any physical science, because, as I've said with the case of the banking system, they simply ignore the contrary arguments of another authority. Okay, you can ignore the outsiders, non-authorities like me, but you ignore the Bank of England and the Bundesbank. What the hell are you doing? Okay, but that's what they will do. And one of my favorite examples, I don't go into a great deal in the manifesto. I do it more in the manuscript of the next book, which I'm putting up on my Patreon and Substack pages, serialized before it comes out with the publishers, hopefully at the end of this year, is looking at the theory of supply. And so the theory of supply says that you have a rising supply curve because the cost of what they call the marginal cost of production rises as you increase the level of output. Now, there have been about at least 40 empirical studies over time, and every last one has found that's wrong. And the most recent one was by Alan Blinder, who was a vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, so a very high-ranking neoclassical economist. He went and asked 200 major American corporations what their cost structures were. 89% of them said they were not what you teach in the textbooks. Now, it just occurred to me a few years ago that he actually writes a textbook. I wonder if he cites his own research in his own textbook. The answer is no.
Don't do as I do as I say, right?
Yeah, do as I believe. And so the neoclassical, and people think, they think the radicals are the ones who are criticizing and pulling down the edifice. We're in the same situation as chemists who are trying to prove that there is no such thing as phlogiston back in the 19th century. But these people still believe in phlogiston, and you can't convince them. And this is what I found. This exchange with Selgin was quite informative, because and other, like I've sent other economists, neoclassical economists, my work on climate change. And you look at what I've shown, it's really the most appallingly bad statistical practices you could ever imagine. And they then said back to me, oh, I wrote to one and said, have you read my, and he said on Twitter where he supported Nordhaus on climate change. And then I wrote to him and said, look, David, you're a good bloke. I don't want you to see down and flame with these bastards. Have a look at how bad their work is. So I sent him a copy of my paper. And then he wrote another tweet on Twitter and I said, have you read my paper? He said, yes, I have. And I said, no, you fucking haven't. You've skimmed it, because I point out that the statistical work that is in there is something that if a kindergarten kid said it, you'd send him back to the womb to relearn. The statistical practices they've done to trivialize the dangers of climate change are appallingly bad statistical practices. But you show it to them, they don't even see it because they're not interested in the reasoning. They simply want to get the conclusion that supports their theory.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of that around. And one of the other observations I would have is, if you think of central banks and central bankers, Michelle Bullock comes out now and gives a press conference after every, machination and decision or non-decision. And yet the media and, the mainstream economists all sort of almost treat her a bit like a god, as though she's got the perfect insight and the perfect understanding of what's going on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's interesting that some of the previous incumbents of RBA land really resented being questioned by the Senate and by, other parliamentarians. So they're almost put up on a pedestal because, well, they think that they know and they are given weight as if they do know. So there is a sort of a second level of lying going on here too, isn't there?
Well, it's actually that this is why I see them as so dangerous, because it's a bit like a cuckoo. Put a cuckoo in a nest, you're not going to have the native species anymore, but you're going to have birds. Now, what happens with the way economists are treated, they're given the same respect that other experts are given. And if I was, if there'd been a collapse of a bridge somewhere, then I'd want a qualified civil engineer to come and explain why the bridge collapsed, and I'd listen to their advice. If I wanted a decent built bridge, I'm not going to do it without civil engineers to do the planning and the structure of the whole thing. So we have to defer to experts because the world in which we live is so ridiculously complicated, more complicated than most people have any appreciation for. The complexity, devices like, here we go, the mobile phone, how many dozens of, more like 100 countries, the number of devices inside there, the refining process, it's ludicrous. You can't understand this thing. You've got to take it for granted. But if you want to ask any questions about it, you're going to ask an expert engineer about how it was done. So we have to defer to experts. Now, economics are the cuckoos in the world of experts because we think they're experts, but they're experts on a completely false model. So we give them the same deference we would to physicists and engineers and even ballet dancers, for that matter, how to do a pirouette. You're not going to ask me. So we defer to experts, but the trouble is they're the cuckoos, and we're deferring to people who've got no part. Can I use French on your show?
Feel free.
No fucking idea of how the system works, but an elaborate model of how it works that they defend to the death. And it'll be our death that they lead to rather than just theirs.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I find frustrating is that once you start seeing the cracks, it's like the old emperor has no clothes, isn't it?
Exactly.
Once you can't look away, and yet you also say, well, I can see the cracks. Why can't you see the cracks?
I know, it's so frustrating. That's why, I get this David Aldo Fatto, the guy I spent my paper on climate change to, and I was just stunned that he couldn't even see this, appallingly bad statistical practice I'm pointing out that just glossed over him, because he just wants to. They don't even realize they want to maintain their belief system. It just comes through automatically. But yeah, once you see the crack, that's the end of it. So I saw my first crack back in 1971, thanks to my dear friend Frank Stilwell, who was my lecturer in first year economics. He's now the emeritus professor of political economy at Sydney University. But Frank, in the middle of a lecture series on microeconomics in first year, explained the theory. It's called the theory of the second best. And that was I think it actually won a Nobel Prize for Lancaster and one other person involved in devising the theory. But that said, imagine you're 2 steps away from perfection, as quoted the textbooks. You've got, in terms of wage setting, let's imagine you have both trade unions and you also have employer associations, and they're both bargaining over the real wage. or the money wage. What happens if you eliminate one or the other? Now, the whole idea of neoclassical theory is to get to the point where you don't have associations and you don't have unions at all. You have competitive workers competing for positions, competitive firms bidding for workers. That's the ideal. If you're two steps away from it, using quite straightforward neoclassical logic, what's called marginal social product and marginal revenue product curves as well are added to the diagram, you find that if you abolish one or the other, you make the social situation worse. Now, I remember, I've never forgotten that experience. Even though I remember I was sitting in the Merriweather Theatre where the lecture was given, I can remember which row I was in. I was just, what? Because I'd argued in favour of abolishing trade unions and abolishing monopolies at some stage as my very first essay at first year. And here I'm being shown that you abolish one or the other, you make it worse. I thought there's got to be something wrong with the theory if it's that fragile. If simply applying the real world to the theory ends up contradicting what the more extreme assumptions lead to, I thought there's got to be errors here. So I went down to the library, right after the lecture, I went to the Merriweather Library and thought I've got to look in the journals and see if any of this stuff turns up. And I found a paper by Paul Samuelson called A Summing Up. And that was his reaction to a critique by my predecessors and now in the non-orthodox economics, criticizing the theory of capital that neoclassical economists use. And he actually conceded defeat. He said the critics are wrong. And his final thing is, if all this causes a heartache for those who believes in the old-time neoclassical religion, I think he actually used that word, we must realize that scholars are not born to live an easy existence. We must respect and appraise the facts of life. That was written in 1966. I was being taught in 1971. That wasn't even turning up in Samuelson's textbook, let alone the other textbooks. When they lose a debate, they ignore the result. And this level of mendacity that's part of the foundation of economics horrifies me, but at the same time, I can understand where it came from. Out of the nature of humans, we are defined by our beliefs. And they, when they see a challenge between their beliefs and the real world, there's only two options. You abandon the beliefs or you abandon acknowledgement of the real world. And unfortunately, the majority of economists do the latter. I'm one of the handful that did the former.
Yeah, well, as a philosopher, I always want to ask the question behind the question behind the question, right? So what are the fundamental assumptions that you're making about the way that you're thinking about what you're thinking about to get to the conclusion you got to, right? And when you start doing that, you then start realizing just how, well, frankly, facile a lot of the assumptions are that economists have made about the way things run. But one of the really interesting discussions, and economists in particular are quite strong on this, is we can't allow debt to get out of hand, particularly public debt. You know, there's public debt's a problem. Is that true, or is that again a fallacy?
It's a fallacy, and this is why double entry bookkeeping is essential, because when you look at money, people still think about money as if it's a commodity. You know, if you and I, we're using gold as a commodity, and you and I are both a bit broke. We could both, back when we lived in Australia, hop in a car, go out to lightning to some local gold mine, do a bit of panning, get a bit of gold. You can have more gold, I can have more gold. When you realize that it's created by double entry bookkeeping, then that physical limitation on money creation disappears. You get more money if banks are willing to create more loans. And you've got to have a public willing to accept those loans as well. But if you have a bubble like the house prices bubbling away, people will do that. So it's actually the debt that controls the whole system, and it's private debt that does it. Now, when you look at government debt, and the way that the private sector creates money is by they increase the asset called loans of banks, and they increase the liability called deposits of banks. When the government creates money, it increases deposits because what the government does, if the government spends more than it takes back in taxation, then it's putting more into private bank accounts than it's taking out of private bank accounts. So that's creating money on the asset side of the banking sector, on the liability side. On the asset side, this crazy microphone here, I'll put it down here, put it out of the way. The asset side, they don't increase the loans of government money creation, they increase reserves. So when if a government runs a deficit, let's take an American figure like $1 trillion. If the government's deficit is $1 trillion, then it's increased deposit accounts by $1 trillion. It's also increased reserves by $1 trillion. Now, that could continue indefinitely. The only negative effect of that would be that the way the reserves are actually increased is by a transfer at the central bank from an account the Treasury has, which is called various things, but things like Consolidated Revenue Funds, CRF, is the term that I think is used in the UK and America. So the Treasury transfers money out of its Consolidated Revenue Fund into reserves, and that's then what creates the money at the banking sector. Now, if that kept on happening, so the government was always spending more than it gets back in taxation, which it should do, it has to do that, create fiat money, then eventually that CRF account will go negative. So governments have said, well, we don't allow our Treasury to have an overdraft account at the central bank. It must have at least a non-negative balance. So we therefore require you to sell bonds. And that's what we call government debt, selling of bonds, not going to a bank and saying, please, sir, can I have some money? It's saying, I'm going to offer this certificate, which I'm going to value at $1,000, and I'm going to pay 5% interest on it, and I'm going to sell that. Now, when you sell it, it's sold in auctions, which are normally run by the central bank in most countries, I believe. I'm not sure. But the Treasury bonds are sold at an auction by the central bank, where the only people who can bid are those people who've got accounts at the central bank. Now, they then buy those bonds with what is equivalent of our bank accounts. You and I have a bank account at a private bank. The banks have accounts at the central bank. Those accounts, which we call them reserves at the banking level, where they're an asset of the private bank. At the central bank, they're a liability of the central bank, and they function just like you and I for deposit accounts. So the way those bonds are purchased is they use the funds in their reserve accounts. So the money that's the funds, it's not money because you can't spend reserve whatever you like. Money you can buy whatever you like. You can go buy a joint with the money. You cannot go and buy a joint with reserves. Okay, so they're very restricted. You can only buy bonds with them. So what normally has happened, certainly for the last 30 years until they started bumping up rates, when the bonds are offered for sale, you have reserves which used to be non-income earning assets, which you couldn't trade. And so the government says, oh, we want to sell you bonds, which are income earning assets that you can trade. Would you like to buy them? The answer is yes, please. So the funds that are used to buy the bonds are created by the Treasury itself. And therefore, there's in no sense can you call that borrowing as it is for you and me. So it's a mistake to call that. What the level of outstanding government debt is not quite accurately. There's a bit of a slip in the double entry as well, which I'm happy to explain later. But the level of government debt is fundamentally the definition of the amount of money that's been created by the government. And if you want to get to zero government debt, then you have zero government money in existence. Now, that ends up being a world in which there's only private money, and that's pretty much what we had in the 19th century. And if people want to go back and take a look at the 19th century, there was a financial crisis like the one we've just been through every 10 to 15 years. And so even though there are problems and issues about how the monetary system is run at the moment, largely because it's dominated by neoclassical economists, imposing crazy rules on the system, but that system was far more stable than this system is far more stable than what happened in the 19th century. So the desire to reduce government debt is a desire to eliminate fiat money from a mixed fiat credit system, and that will cause the same instabilities we got back in the 19th century.
And again, if you listen to politicians, they keep going on about, oh, you've got to keep the debt down. There's an election in the UK at the moment, and both sides are working within a very constrained environment because they're worried about blowing out the debt later. And so they're prioritizing more on defense and less on, socials. So politicians are making decisions, but again, inside this false assumption that's been created about, is debt good, is debt bad, driven by those same economists.
It is. This is why we've done disastrous things like, for example, almost eliminate the NASA program. If we hadn't had this obsession on keeping government debt down, we'd have moon bases by now. We'd not even have a Mars base. Instead, we're relying upon the private sector maybe to get there 60 years later. we would have far better health, far better education. So all this stuff has meant the underinvesting in education, infrastructure, health and services and so on, in the belief we've got to keep government debt down. Uh, what that has done is just reduce the future we're giving to our children. We sort of say we can't give all this debt to our kids. You're supposed to be giving schools and health systems to your kids, thanks very much. But you're not doing it. And what it means is there's going to be less government bonds outstanding. Well, that's going to be really helpful. It is just a completely wrong-headed vision, but you cannot get them to relent on it. And it's so frustrating to see that and just see that we're setting ourselves up for catastrophe in the future over something which is not an issue, but it's all due to economists not understanding how money is created.
Right. And just to underscore that, a lot of economists sit inside the Treasury. The Treasury then is shaped by that economic thinking that then actually determines what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of budget papers and Treasury papers. And when politicians then go and talk to the Treasury, that guess what? They get the same. So that indoctrination percolates through. So wherever you look in the political sphere, it's again linked directly back to those fallacies that we've been exploring.
It is, and that's they don't realize they're doing harm. This is actually most economists that I know quite a large number, are fairly altruistic. Yes. They actually think they're making the system better. People think they're saying it because they're paid to. No, it's even worse. They're saying it because they believe it. And I'll actually take a quote out of one of my favorite movies, Don't Look Up. The recent analogy for global warming. Yes. And at one stage, when I've forgotten the name of the female star that Jennifer Lawrence plays, but she's hanging out with a bunch of social not retards, but social rejects, and they're talking about what they think is being done by the powers that be. And she finally says, "Hey guys, the truth is way more depressing. They're not smart enough to be as evil as you give them credit for." So the trouble is, these aren't evil people. They're not being paid to do what they do. They sincerely believe it, and that's why they're leading it to catastrophe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Unfortunately, that is often the way. It's not actually a big grand conspiracy theory. It's just human stupidity because they don't actually think outside the box a little bit.
That's right.
Steve, there are a couple of questions that came in, which I might be interested just to get your take on, and I might have a dog barking in a second. So let me just throw this one at you. What's your take on Bitcoin in terms of new money? Is it relevant? Is it not relevant?
Like, I wish I'd bought Bitcoin when Max Kaiser and Stacey Herbert told me about it. I could have bought 100 Bitcoin for less than £1,000 and I'd be a millionaire now. So I'm sorry I didn't ride the bubble. But to me, there are three main, people talk about three features of money. It's a unit of account, a means of payment, and a store of value. Now, Keynes himself made the point back in the 1930s that using money as a store of value is crazy because it doesn't appreciate. Why would you hang on to it? He then said, we hang on to money. It's a measure of our disquietude about our own expectations about the future. The more uncertain we are about the future, the more we want to have our assets in liquid form, which is what money is, rather than illiquid form, which all our other assets are. But if you focus on the store of value side, then if you have something which is appreciating as Bitcoin has done, it's something like about 20 or 30% per annum since it was founded. You don't want to spend that. There is one guy, I've forgotten who it was, who bought a pizza with 100 Bitcoin. If he'd waited, he could have bought the pizza chain with 100 Bitcoin. So what it encourages is less spending. Now, that may at one stage be a good idea, but the other trouble is, so he doesn't actually promote turnover, it promotes hoarding, which is not what you want to have. You want money to be used for transactions, not hoarding it, and therefore not spending. That's one problem. The other is the energy, and this is what really was the clincher for me. The way that Bitcoin is verified is by people getting a whole bunch of people doing what they call Bitcoin mining. And what that amounts to is running random number generators until you get a whole string of zeros, which they call a nonce. And the first person to get that then records the transaction, propagates it through the rest of the system, and then gets, if there's still Bitcoin mining going on, gets the Bitcoin. And that's the major encouragement for people to do mining. The amount of energy, it's set up in such a way it takes 10 minutes of computer time to actually get to that nonce. And that 10 minutes of energy usage is the amount of energy involved that we need to breach it to breach the system is so great that nobody will do it. That means that the energy consumption of Bitcoin now is roughly equivalent to Switzerland. And it was, equivalent to smaller countries in the past. The more the value rises, and while the mining is still going on, the higher the price, the energy consumption of Bitcoin. And knowing what I knew about the climatic system, I said, well, at some point, we're going to be forced to drastically reduce our energy consumption. And two of the easy things we do will be ban international tourism and ban Bitcoin. So I can see it continuing to rise until such time as we have a catastrophe that really takes people's breath away. And then with that impact, okay, what's the easiest way you can reduce energy consumption now? Ban Bitcoin. So, ride it while it's going up. I think at some point it's going to disappear.
And just talking about energy consumption, of course, the other big technological innovation is artificial intelligence. And I would argue that AI is another huge energy drain, despite the fact that there might be some productivity gains, et cetera, et cetera. So would you sort of put AI in a similar risk bucket, or do you see it rather differently?
No, I agree with you. I mean, because I tried a bit of AI. I mean, it'd be incredibly useful in a range of ways. For example, medical diagnosis. If you type your symptoms into a AI system and list them all, it's going to search the entire range of known diseases and known symptoms, and probably do a better job than a doctor can do in saying what your actual illness is. So that's quite worthwhile. But other stuff, I tried to get it to do a cartoon I wanted to do. And I tried and I tried and I tried, and I finally gave up. I wasn't going to get the cartoon the way I wanted to do it. But the amount of energy involved in that, it was huge. And if you look at if we actually wanted to go from where we use our own mines, like our mines, I'm not sure of the actual wattage, but I think our mines work on about 20 or 30 watts of power. When you're running these AI systems, you're talking tens of thousands of kilowatts potentially, and for large queries and so on. So the energy consumption is off the scale, and we're also getting, what they're now calling AI hallucinations turning up. So even if AI was going in the correct direction to where it could literally be artificial intelligence, and I don't believe it is, but even if it did do that, then the energy consumption needs of trying to replace everything we currently do with AI would overwhelm the planet, let alone the rest of the damage we're doing to it by energy consumption for other purposes.
Absolutely. Yeah, well, it's interesting because I don't hear a lot of balanced discussion about AI. You've got obviously those big companies who are pushing the barrow, and you've got a lot of people worried about AI taking over the world. But the energy conundrum seems to me to be a big part of it. And in the environmental situation that we're in, to me, it's a question that I think should be explored a little more than it currently is.
As always, but most of the important questions don't get asked,
let
alone answered.
Now, Robbie Barwick from the Citizens Party drops a question in right at the start of the show. You may know that we've been battling in Australia about maintaining the access to cash, and there was a review done of regional banking, but one of the recommendations was to create a public bank in Australia, a public bank. So rather than actually just relying on the private system, have effectively a bank maybe attached to the post office. So Robbie asked a question about what's your perspective in terms of the role of a public bank in society, and does it make sense?
I think it does make sense. The trouble is the public bank can end up behaving the same way the private banks do. So you look back to I don't think it was 2007, it was another crisis earlier on, maybe the 1990s, but the State Bank of Victoria got involved in a huge range of, bubble type funding and finally folded. And I think that was actually the time that Jeff Kennett became a leader of Victoria. So the collapse of the State Bank of Victoria was a major factor in the swing to the right in Victoria and in Australia 20 or 30 years ago. So they can end up behaving the same way, which are one of the dangers. But if you had a bank which was, they say, specifically devoted just to being literally for transactions, so it didn't actually even offer loans, that would be feasible through a postal bank service. And that can mean you do transactions without the transaction being damaged by any disasters in the credit system. So I'm in favor of a public bank, but you need to have people running the public bank who aren't economists, and that's one of your problems.
Exactly. Yes, it has to be thought differently about, right? If it's going to be successful. And, we certainly have been pushing very hard the idea that maintaining the use of cash in the system is really, really important. And the last thing you want to do is to go digital to the point where you've got no control, because basically the retail banks, know everything about your transactions and can turn the system off. And of course, we've seen recently, banks systems going down, or the energy system going down, and suddenly people can't transact. So maintaining cash is important, and particularly in regional areas as well, maintaining basic banking services. So it looks as though that is going to be something which is going to be explored as a result of the Senate inquiry, which is perhaps quite exciting and interesting. Watch this space, I guess. So Steve, as we come to sort of the end of our conversation, we've clearly highlighted lots of different areas where economists who are in, the maelstrom of trying to work out what to do are actually misplacing their decisions and miscommunicating on what's really going on because of the mistakes they're making. I get the sense, though, that you're not suggesting that things are going to change anytime soon.
No, I think humans only seem to change direction after they're smashed into a brick wall somewhere. And so we hit the financial crisis, and there'd really be no effective change after that. They managed to, sticky tape the system together to continue doing the same bad things they were doing before the financial crisis. But you can do that because all it was a case of pumping money into the system, and the government can create money when necessary to do that, which is what they did through QE. So in that sense, it's fairly easy to prepare a system with the financial problem while still maintaining the same bad system. That can't be done with climate. If we realise we've been completely conned by economists about the climate, and we have been, and we suddenly find that the physical system that we live in are being destroyed by the climate, then there's no simple salve to that. We are stuck, and that's, I think, what we're approaching. You may have seen, I don't know the guy's name all that well, but you would have seen there was a British media commentator who specialises in medicine, who died on a holiday in Greece recently.
Michael Mosley. Seen that? Michael
Mosley, yeah. Yep. He died of heat exhaustion.
Yep.
He was 80 meters. When you finally find him, he was dead, 80 meters from the beach he was trying to reach. And the thing was, he went walking when the temperature normally would have been 24 degrees. It was actually 40. He died of heat exhaustion. Now, he's an extremely healthy, extremely fit person, advises on health, and died going for a walk in a 40-degree temperature. And I hope that's a bit of a wake-up call for people in the Daily Mail who are actually admitting he died of heat exhaustion, because the Daily Mail has been a strong climate change denier for quite some time. So we're starting to see things that happen, think, hang on, that doesn't matter. That doesn't make sense if climate's not a problem. Now, once you have something catastrophic where 10 million people die of heat exhaustion, or an entire wheat crop gets wiped out by climatic damage, or we have hurricanes and tornadoes destroying houses and productive facilities in America, it's too late. Okay? So the only way to get out of it is to drastically reduce energy consumption, to ration, to behave like we're in a world war, which we are, but it's a world war against the damage we're doing to the climate. So we're not going to change direction. And economists are going to give us the worst possible advice until that point, and they should simply be thrown out. I mean, I'm in favour of universal basic income for one major reason. That's to pay the economists to go and do something less damaging.
And that is a shocking thought, isn't it? That actually economists are not neutral, right? Economists are not, sitting there in the back room and effectively just worrying about numbers and things. What they are doing is messing with society, messing with government policy, messing with the planet. And yet they don't seem particularly aware that that's what they're doing.
Well, in their own model, they can't see that. It doesn't turn up in their own model. Like I'll finish with William Nordhaus's 1991 paper, which I still... You had to think of the two most ridiculous economic papers I've ever read. One would be William Nordhaus's To Slow or Not to Slow, about the global warming. Another, Richard Toll, The Economic Impact of Climate Change. Now, the water wouldn't have done him any good. Okay, you will die in 6 hours in those sort of temperatures, even if you're extremely healthy and fit. That particular instance may be different, but in general, people are going to die of heat exhaustion, and no matter what is going to save them. In fact, in what's it called, the Ministry for the Future, it's a fictional book that I didn't particularly like, but everybody who's dead bar one person was in a lake at the in the end of that particular book. I've got distracted by the comment. I'm
Sorry.
Okay, they've got to come back and say it's not in their perspective. They don't even see these things in their own framework. So they believe they're doing good because in their framework, what they're doing works. But this is why having a false paradigm is so dangerous, because you're doing it in a planet that doesn't exist. And that's the danger. So back to Nordhaus. He argued that climate change would only reduce global GDP by 1/4% compared to what it would have been in the total absence of climate change at 3 degrees of warming. And part of that, he said, the reason for that conclusion was he assumed that 87% of the American economy would be unaffected by climate change because it takes place in what he called carefully controlled environments that are not really exposed to the climate. Now, he even included mining in that list. No joke, mining. And then somebody must have pointed out to him, oh, William, there's open cut mining. That's exposed to the weather, isn't it? So his next paper came out and said rather than 87%, it's 85%. And he specified underground mining is unaffected. Now, that really means it just shows he believes the roof will protect you from climate change. Take a look at some of the roofs in Texas that were hit by those tornadoes. They don't last very long. But the other thing is carefully controlled environments, that implies factories, you put in goods, inputs at one end, goods come out the other end. Every factory relies upon inputs from some other factory somewhere. What if the roads are destroyed? Okay. So what he's doing is mistaking the map for the territory. And because his little formula says GDP equals a function of labor and capital, close brackets, everything happens inside the brackets, and that's a carefully controlled environment. There are roads, mate. Okay. You've got to travel, that you move this. So it's totally non-biophysical vision of how the economy operates. And therefore, he literally, all the advice you're seeing from economists about relatively trivial damages assume that a roof will protect you from climate change. Well, welcome to the 2020s and 2030s. You're going to find out just how reliable that prediction is.
Well, Steve, I want to say thank you very, very much. You mentioned your Patreon and Substack. I put the Substack link in the comments below and also showed it on screen a couple of times. Do recommend you go and check Steve's work out. Always insightful and enjoyable to discuss, Steve, with you. Thank you very much for your time today. And I want to say to all the economists, just look up, right?
That's exactly the analogy. Absolutely.
Thank you very much, Steve. I'm going to take you offline and I'll close the show. And we must catch up again sometime soon.
I have to do it, definitely. I'll hang around with a bit of a chat about that in a moment.
Yeah, great.
Close the show down. Okay.
All right. Yep. Okay. I'm going to take you off and I'll just close the show. There you go, folks. I hope you enjoyed that. Very, very important conversation from Steve, and so much to explore there. Just to say that next week I'll have Leith Van Onselen on, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the economics, the immediate, and of course he's an economist. Shh, don't tell anybody. Anyway, look forward to that. And just before I go, the dogs, yep, they're sound asleep. They did bark a couple of times, but hopefully that was pretty good. And thank you very much for the super chats, for all the comments and questions. We didn't get to them all, but we got through. That was good. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And also check out our recorded shows in the meantime. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. See you later. Bye.